Hi, everyone. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thank you for coming to my channel. And today I want to give a lecture on this titled Absolute Certainty from Russell to Wittgenstein. And in this lecture, I'm going to tell you a very abridged story, curated with a particular end in mind of Bertrand Russell to Ludwig Wittgenstein. And I just want to mention at the outset that I have to skip a lot of important or interesting details about their lives because I only have 30 minutes to give this talk and I have a very particular end goal in mind. So I'll just encourage you to, if you're interested in these characters and you want more, there's plenty of other resources out there after this talk where you can find out a lot more about their lives and a lot more interesting details and also about their philosophy. And I'll point to some of these references at the end. In a lot of ways, I see this story as a metaphor for something that's raging inside of me, as some kind of tension inside of me and how I see philosophy, and I'll try to bring that home in the last couple slides of the talk. So let's start the talk off by thinking about Bertrand Russell. And I'm going to start by just introducing, well, he was 98 years old, so he lived for a very long time and he wrote this really extensive autobiography. So we know a lot about his life, and he's wrote a lot about his childhood and his early life and things in the autobiography. One thing I want to highlight in particular, though, is that he talks about being very depressed as a teenager and thinking about committing suicide, and he attributes this tutor that he had introducing Euclidean geometry to him as being somehow this thing that got him passionate about something and was able to provide some meaning to his life and pursuit and got him away from maybe some of this depression he was feeling. But I think part of what he was enamored by was this axiomatic method, this idea that you could put down just five axioms and have some rules of inference, and from that you could deduce all of Euclidean geometry. He just thought this was so exciting and beautiful. And I think part of what he was drawn to there was this idea that if you provide a firm foundation, then you can somehow establish truth with absolute certainty on top of this foundation. You're going to see this theme come up throughout this talk when I'm talking about Russell um, and how he approaches his philosophy. And so he got enamored by this idea of mathematics, and he went on in university to study mathematics. And one of the things he comments on, though, is that while studying mathematics, he was just a little bit disappointed in the math professors because he found that they just weren't interested in these like foundational philosophical questions about mathematics. And I would argue, as a math professor myself, that I find this to be the case about most of the math professor colleagues that I have. I think it's just still true that mathematicians are generally just not that interested in philosophy. So it's still true today, and I can understand what he had in mind. And so after university, Bertrand Russell goes on to study philosophy, and in the philosophy world, he was disappointed as well because there he just saw these guys are crazy. I mean, they'll think about any question, and they abuse language all over the place, and there's just no structure, there's no precision. It's just all over the place. It's just chaos. And so he was disappointed with both of these communities for very different reasons. And this is an interesting point because it shows in especially in Russell's 20s and 30s, but really for the rest of his life, he really creates a through line between these two communities. He's very much a philosopher, but he's very much like a mathematical philosopher. He's going to lean on formal logic as a tool for providing, precision and rigor to philosophy. And that's how we should think of the analytic philosophy tradition. In many ways, you can think of Bertrand Russell as the father, though oftentimes we point to Frege because Frege came first and very much influenced Russell. But Russell was the character who had enough of a personality to kind of make things really popular and have it catch on. So in a lot of ways, Bertrand Russell is a good character to think of as like the one of the founding fathers of this tradition, along with Frege and More and others. Um, and so at some point he meets Alfred North Whitehead, who is a mathematician, but a mathematician who's also has much philosophical leanings. And so they together embark on this extremely ambitious project to provide a foundation, not just for like Euclidean geometry, but all of mathematics, and in particular arithmetic or number theory would be like the first goal, but he wants to provide a foundation analogous to the axiomatic method for Euclidean geometry for all of mathematics, which is quite an ambitious project. But this was a project that was very much in the air at the time. I mean, there's Hilbert's program at the time that was laid out, and then Ernst Zermelo was also working on these things that which became Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory that we see as the often the orthodox foundation of what mathematics is now. But it was a very ambitious project, and it was particularly in the tradition of logicism, which was started by Frege, which makes the project even more ambitious. And I can't tell you what logicism is about in this talk, but you can look it up if you're interested. And they wrote 3 volumes, approximately 1,900 pages, and approximately 10 years of work. And these 1,900 pages are quite dense. They look like this is a sample of what it might look like: a ton of symbols, in this sort of very formal derivations of all kinds of things from these base principles, and it's extremely difficult work. And Russell laments that his mental health was definitely affected negatively in this time because it was just so difficult, and they ran into so many issues over and over and over again. Russell and Zermelo discovered this issue in Frege's work, this Russell-Zermelo paradox. And so a lot of what he was trying to do with Whitehead was to try to fix that paradox, but it was like a very slippery thing to try to fix, and he kept running into problems, and just a stressful time. And it wound up being 3 volumes, but they had to publish it themselves. They couldn't even get it published because the publisher was worried that no one was going to read it. And honestly, Russell admits that probably not many people did. One of the people that he said, probably the only person that read it was Kurt Gödel, but quite an important person to read it, of course. I can't say too much more about that at this time, but again, he was trying to provide a foundation for mathematics. And but it's more than just that, because in the analytic philosophy, they're not just mathematicians. They want to talk about the kind of questions philosophers talk about. So that means you have to deal with natural language somehow. And so there's this linguistic turn, which we identify in Frege's work, but also is very much influential on Russell, which is this desire to try to take language and make it more precise. So just to give you a very, very simple model of the kind of thing that they're worried about, I'm just going to present an example of what's called the fallacy of equivocation. So let's take this very simple example. The first premise is that feathers are light. Sure, that's true. Light cannot be dark. Yeah, they're opposites of each other. And so therefore, feathers cannot be dark. But we know that that's just not a true conclusion. But the way it's written, there's nothing wrong with the logic. If I take these premises as they are, the logic seems to work, and each premise seems to be true. But this is not a correct argument. So what's wrong, right? We call this an informal fallacy because the issue with the argument is sort of hidden behind the scenes in the vagueness of how language works. So you can pause the video if you want for a second to try to think of what the problem is. But I'm going to tell you what the problem is here, which is that, the word light is being used in 2 different ways, right? In the first premise, light is being used in reference to weight. In the second premise, light is being used in reference to luminosity. And that breaks the logical chain here, and it doesn't actually work. But of course, this is a very simple example, and I don't expect you would have been stumped for this for very long. You would have figured this out. And so it's an extremely simplistic example, but the point is, like, if you take a work of philosophy, 500 to 1,000 pages of philosophy, there's going to be many, many words and many, many sentences, and they're going to make up new words. And the chances that they equivocated somewhere, or the chances that the vagueness in their language has created a illogical conclusion, seems to be super high. In fact, I would even venture to say the chances that they didn't make a mistake like this somewhere in their edifice is almost impossible. Right? It's just there's so many words that it just can't be the case. And so, the first project, I would say, of the analytic philosophers is to clean up language, to analyze it carefully, and to put it into like this logically perfect form where we avoid all these mistakes of vagueness, right? That the analytic philosophers are worried about. But there's an extra claim being made here, which is that it's not just about disambiguating language, which I think most people can agree is probably a good project, even if we don't want to do the project ourselves. But they're saying that furthermore, if you disambiguate language and come up with this logically perfect language, then it will reveal philosophical truths, which is a further claim that we don't have to buy necessarily, but that is something we should take for granted when we're thinking about these analytic philosophers. And, famously, Russell pointed to Hegel and Moore were responding to Hegel and saying, like, this guy, he's writing all these words, but he's just so vague, and it's no way that these conclusions follow from the arguments he's making. Right? He says this illustrates an important truth, namely that the worse your logic, the more interesting the consequences to which it gives rise. Right? So again, this is what they're worried about. They want to avoid this kind of Hegelian mess of words that they see, right? If you like Hegel, then forgive me. I'm just expressing the views of Russell, and honestly, I've read almost no Hegel, so I can't comment on the thing myself. But it is something that I also find to be worried about when I'm reading certain philosophy, right? Are we being too vague to the point where we can't even make a logical argument anymore? And so enters Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I can tell you very little about his life. So I'm just going to jump to the fact that at some point he gets connected with Bertrand Russell and, to study mathematical philosophy in grad school with Russell. And so he's Russell's student, and he gets interested, or he gets introduced to the Principia Mathematica. And at the time, though, Russell is also thinking about trying to put a firm foundation to science and epistemology as well. He doesn't want to just put a foundation to mathematics. So now he wants to put a firm foundation to science and epistemology and empirical claims, right, about the world. And so Wittgenstein gets sort of talking to Russell about these ideas, and they both wind up forming a version of logical atomism, which is their way of trying to put a absolutely certain foundation, if you will, on empirical claims for epistemology. And, their logical atomisms are very different, or have very, differences, but in this very shortened form that I'm giving to you now, I'm going to treat them basically as exactly the same, except for at the end where I'll focus on Wittgenstein's more sort of mystical way of handling this at the end. But for now, I'm just going to treat them as if they're exactly the same, because in a shortened form like this, they might as well be the same. But if you read them at any point and dive into the details, you'll notice that there are differences in their logical atomism approach. But the idea is as following. Again, language can be analyzed into a logically perfect form. You might disagree with that premise, but you should take it for granted right now in this to try to understand this argument. So let's assume that can be done. And let's basically assume it's already been done. Even though it's a huge project in the analytic philosophy tradition, for the sake of this argument, let's just assume it's already been done. Okay. And not only that, but when you're in this logically perfect form, it's going to reveal this underlying structure of language and the world. And so the goal here is to link up in language, in this logically perfect language, the propositions which can be true and false in this logically perfect language, and fill them with truth by linking them to something in the world. Right? You don't want to just have T and Fs being some symbols in your logically perfect language. You want them to be filled with truth, and filled with truth by something you point to in the world, right? So that's the goal here, is to do that. And it's an atomistic view. So somehow you're going to take something complex and boil it down into little pieces, right? So in atomisms, though, can come in various different forms. So what are the pieces that we're looking for in this particular theory? Well, for Russell and Wittgenstein, the idea is that we're going to have these atomistic facts about the world. So to start with the fact about the world, there's something simple like there's books on my shelf. So there's a book on my bookshelf. That's a fact about the world, right? It's an empirical fact about the world. The problem is that fact is quite complex because, for instance, the book, any one of these books is filled with a ton of pages, which has ink on it. It has all kinds of different properties, and each book itself can be boiled down to lots of itty bitty pieces of what we might call atomic objects that I don't want to try to be any more specific about. But I just want you to notice that a book is already an extremely complex thing, and the bookshelf is also extremely complex. And the relationship between all the different atomic objects that make up the book and all the different atomic objects that make up the bookshelf is going to be an extremely complicated relation in itself. So what they're claiming is that you can take this fact that a book is on my bookshelf and decompose it into these atomic facts that make up relations between the different atomic objects that make up these complex objects, right? So it's a very difficult project to actually like parse out the details of, but that's the idea, right? And again, these objects can be decomposed into atomic objects, and that's what names are going to refer to. Here in this theory, you should think of names as just being labels, and we want to kind of label the atomic ontology of the world, which is just going to be this listing of all these atomic objects. And then once we've listed out all the atomic objects and given them names, now we can build up these atomic facts, which are somehow the relations between these atomic objects. And then from there, we can build up all the complex facts that make up the things we want to say about the world. And if you can pull this off, the idea is that you have established this like foundation of these atomic facts, which make up the some kind of foundation that can provide absolute certainty to empirical claims. And you've sort of brought the axiomatic method into this sort of empirical world, and what a beautiful project to try to do, right? But it's very difficult to point to what these atomic facts or these atomic objects are, and that's a very difficult and shortcoming of the theory. But again, this is supposed to provide a basis for science and epistemology. And now is where I'm going to differentiate Wittgenstein versus Russell. For Wittgenstein, everything else that's not math and not science and not like somehow an epistemology about history or something like that, about empirical claims, everything else just cannot be spoken of. That's it, full stop. You just cannot speak of anything metaphysical, can't talk about God or whether God exists, free will, all this stuff. Like, you just can't do it. And so you shouldn't do it. And this is where Russell is not going to agree with that. Russell acknowledges that logical atomism does not, get to ethics, but he's going to then want to try to put ethics on a firm footing as well. He doesn't think that it's impossible. But Wittgenstein is quite different in this way, and so he says the following. He says, my propositions are elucidatory in this way. He who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless when he has climbed out through them, on them, over them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. So again, Wittgenstein's saying he's acknowledging this paradox in his Tractatus, which is where he develops his logical atomism. He's saying, I just wrote 100 pages on the Tractatus on this logical atomism, and those words I wrote were not empirical claims and they were not mathematical claims. So according to my theory, those words I just wrote were all useless or were all senseless. They were not in this logically perfect language. And so how does he make sense of this, right? So this is his way of trying to make sense of it. He's saying, listen, I was just trying to elucidate to you. I was just trying to point you in the right direction. But what you should do is take my words, climb up over them, try to understand them, see what I'm trying to say, and then throw them out because they're a bunch of nonsense anyway, right? It's just kind of bizarre. It's kind of bizarre thing to say in the analytic philosophy tradition. This is not the kind of flavor you're going to get from almost any other analytic philosopher. And he has this very mystical sort of feeling about this, that it's for him, the things that cannot be talked about that go beyond science and mathematics are actually the most important things about human beings. Ethics and God and all these other things about meaning for him are the most important things for human beings. The problem is you just can't talk about them clearly. And so he has these ideas that maybe you can just experience them. Maybe you can just feel them, and this is where it becomes like this mystical sort of ineffable things that and so at the end, this very famous line at the end of the Tractatus is that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Right? So you just you can't talk about these other things and you have to just be silent. So now we're going to see, though, that Wittgenstein is going to change his mind quite dramatically in what we call the late Wittgenstein. So what I just talked to you about is what's called early Wittgenstein, where he was very much influenced by Russell, and he writes the Tractatus, which is the only book that was actually published during his lifetime. And the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists, read the Tractatus and they say, oh, there seems to be some similarities here. So they want to reach out and talk. Some of them want to reach out and talk to Wittgenstein. And so there's various different conversations that go on between some of the members of the Vienna Circle and Wittgenstein. He never attends the Vienna Circle on any rate, but he does wind up talking to these people. And it seems like during this time, I assume that they provided some kind of concreteness to Wittgenstein's very abstract theory in the Tractatus. And at some point, Wittgenstein just thinks his original project was just complete nonsense. Yeah. And it's funny because Wittgenstein in the Tractatus claimed to have solved all the problems of philosophy. And during this period, he goes to think that that was just complete nonsense. He didn't solve any of the problems. And so now I want to make that transition with you away from Russell's ideas and away from early Wittgenstein's ideas to his later ideas. And so that's going to be, we're going to talk a little bit about philosophical investigations and On Certainty, which are his two major later works, which everything else of Wittgenstein was published after he died. And so in the philosophical investigations, he writes in these aphorisms, and which I really like, but a lot of people can find quite frustrating. And these aphorisms are, the one thing that is definitely frustrating is they're not organized into any themes. It's like, why didn't you organize this into some kind of thematic structure? He just keeps repeating himself on page 10 and then on page 120. And it just kind of like, it's bizarre in that way. But I do find it quite enjoyable and interesting to read. But, throughout the philosophical investigations, he kind of keeps repeating himself and being critical of his prior work, extremely critical of his prior work, explicitly and then also implicitly at times. And he's also critical of Frege and Russell. And he's particularly critical of this idea of theology as grammar, which is what I mentioned to you earlier, which is somehow this idea that when you analyze language into its logically perfect form, it will somehow reveal this underlying truth about the world. This is what he calls theology as grammar. He's saying, this is some religious belief that you have about language that's just not grounded in any, can't be known to be true in any way. It's just theology. And he's very critical of that. And so for the later Wittgenstein, there's a completely opposite view. There's no logically perfect language. In fact, every language, no matter what, is imprecise. Language is inherently imprecise, and there's no avoiding the vagueness of language for him. And so he introduces this idea of a language game. And for him, a language game is like, so, in the Tractatus, he tries to take all of languages and just boil them down into one logically perfect language. And now it's like we're going the opposite direction. And sometimes we're just going to embrace every possible language at any possible layer of community size. They're all languages, and we can't say one is different than the other in some sense. They're just all language games, and what they are is some community that I'm a part of. It could be my family, it could be at work, it could be the city of New York City, or, all these different communities that I am incorporated in. These communities will determine a way of using words, and they'll have different assumptions about life and different assumptions about how we should use words. And those assumptions and these things come together to form a language game. And we, as a community, we impose rules on how language should be used, which put some guardrails on a particular language game. But as me, I can enter in and out of all kinds of different language games throughout my life and throughout my day, depending on who I'm interacting with. And he introduces language games very early on in the philosophical investigations. But as a reader, you might say, I don't think you've given a very precise definition of what a language game is. And at some point, Wittgenstein is very aware of this issue, and he takes it head on and says, hey, I'm saying language is inherently precise. You can't ask me for a precise definition then. It just doesn't make sense. All I can do is list out examples until you figure out the family resemblance between these examples. But for Wittgenstein, he says, this is just how language is. This is how you define anything. When you try to tell me what a sport is, you just start listing out various different sports, and then eventually I realize what you mean by a sport. Right? And if you want to try to tell me what a board game is, you don't give me a precise definition. You just list out a bunch of examples of board games until I get the idea. But that doesn't mean we have the exact same meaning of what a board game is. It just means that our idea of what a board game is similar enough to that we can make use of the word board game together in our language game. And so he's saying that's all we can ever do is get these family resemblances for words. And so from that also comes this idea that the meaning of words comes from how they're used in a language community, by a language game. And so I don't learn the meaning of words by like looking up their precise definition somewhere. Of course, he's not saying that you can't make use of a dictionary or anything like that, but that we come to the meaning of words by just observing how people use them and observing the effect that those words have on the world and have on people in the world, and then learning to use it in a similar way in that particular language game or that community that uses the word that way. And from this comes this idea of linguistic therapy, which is something that's continuous from the early to late Wittgenstein. This idea that when you understand how language works, that it'll tell you how you should do philosophy. So for him, there's this linguistic therapy, which is like the philosopher treats a question and treats it like an illness, right? So the point is that when you point out how language actually works, these philosophical problems will just evaporate, right? And there's many different places in the philosophical investigations where he says things like this, and this really pissed off a lot of philosophers. And famously, it pissed off Karl Popper, who was just like, "Come on, man! There's clearly legitimate philosophical questions out there. Like, why are you saying that they're just going to dissolve when we understand language, right?" And I will say I'm sympathetic to Popper's view here, even though I like the way Wittgenstein expresses this because I find it kind of fun and poetic and things. But I also understand Popper's point that I still think there are lots of interesting philosophical questions. They're not going to go away. They might just be relative to a language game. Maybe that's part of what Wittgenstein is saying. But I don't think these philosophical questions go away. But his other idea is that another thing that he keeps talking about in the investigations is that explanation begins somewhere, right? In the analytic philosophy tradition, there's this huge emphasis on rational argument, of course, and logical argument. But what Wittgenstein is trying to point you to is that anytime you make a rational argument, it has to begin somewhere. Like the axiomatic method has to begin at axioms. And, logical atomism has to begin at some sort of like atomic facts. And any kind of rational argument has to begin somewhere. And the problem is that wherever it begins, you cannot give an absolutely certain foundation for. And so you can call them like self-evident truths if you like, but that's a very unsatisfying thing. And so we have to make peace with the fact that explanation begins somewhere, and we can't justify the beginnings of the explanation, right? So argument is useful because we can use it to persuade people and influence and try to build cohesion amongst people, but it's not a way of establishing absolute certainty or establishing truth for Wittgenstein. It's just a useful way to communicate amongst people who hold similar assumptions about the world, right? So in uncertainty, he calls it hinge epistemology. Like each of us have these hinge beliefs at the core of our beliefs that we cannot justify, but we take for granted. And from those hinge beliefs, we build the rest of our beliefs, maybe via some kind of rational argument. But the hinges are beyond reproach. That's where explanation begins, and we cannot be certain of these hinges. We just take them for granted. And so you get this idea that certainty is always inherently relative to the language game we are playing, relative to the assumptions we're making when we play that language game. For instance, most of us, when I say to you that I'm certain that I had my keys this morning, what I'm saying is not that I'm absolutely certain in some kind of like universal, philosophical sense. What I mean is that relative to the kind of assumptions I make, that we're all willing to make, that physical objects exist, and that my memory is at least reasonably reliable, and so on and so on and so forth. Relative to those regular assumptions we all make, I'm certain that I have my keys, right? That's what certainty means. And when I use this word certainty, it really matters like what language game I'm playing, because when I'm playing the language game of philosophy, it might mean something very different than when I'm talking to you on a very everyday basis, right? So I just want to, as I'm coming to the end of this talk, I just want to, point to some of these quotes that I really like from On Certainty, which is one of my favorite books by Wittgenstein. It's only about 100 pages long. It is a bunch of aphorisms again, but I really think it's a very good book to reflect on. And I think for me, it provides a lot of humility to my life. And I think it can produce humility in a lot of others. So here's two quotes. Where two principles really do meet, which cannot be reconciled with one another, then each man declares the other a fool and a heretic. I think we've all had this experience with somebody before. I feel absolutely certain of something. Someone else feels absolutely certain of something. And we try to talk to each other. But at some point, we find that we cannot convince the other person of our views, and we get angry, we get frustrated, and we come with all kinds of different words to disparage that other person, right? I might call them unscientific. I might call them pseudo-intellectual. I might call them simple-minded. You might say that I'm elitist, or you might say someone doesn't have street smarts, or there's various different ways that we come up with to disparage somebody who doesn't agree with our absolutely certain beliefs. And Wittgenstein is trying to get us to reflect on that. What does that mean? Are we really certain? And what does it mean to be certain? Another quote in this direction, he says, I said I would combat the other man, but wouldn't I give him reason? Certainly, but how far do they go? At the end of reasons comes persuasion. Think what happens when missionaries convert natives, right? So here he's using the word persuasion in a different way. Yes, of course, rational argument can persuade people. But when your rational argument doesn't change someone's mind, that's where this ugly form of persuasion begins, which is where you start becoming violent. Maybe you want to hit the person, or you go to war with somebody, or you want to use your power that you have to just, you know, bring destruction upon someone in your life. This is the terrible part of what we do as human beings. We've been doing this throughout the entire history of humanity, and we've all done this in one way or the other. It may have just been as simple as saying something nasty to somebody we disagree with, or it could be even more intense, like starting a war with somebody or whatever. But we all do this at times, and it's an ugly part of who we are as human beings. And that's why I think it's really important in uncertainty to reflect on this inherent uncertainness. I just think that everything is just inherently uncertain, that the world is just full of gray area, and we need to make peace of that. So this brings me to the end of my talk, that where I just want to give you a little sense of how I think about philosophy. I think philosophy needs to teach us to make peace of the inherent uncertainty in the world. It needs to teach us how to become comfortable with the gray area of life. And, we need to build these structures. We need to conceptualize the world. It's not avoidable, right? But I think we should think about it through this lens of like all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And what I don't think we should do is try to convince ourselves that if we build a large enough framework and with enough detail that maybe we can establish black and white truth. To me, this is a complete mistake. And when we do that, we just delude ourselves into thinking that we've found something that makes us better than those other people on the other side. Instead, in my view, philosophy needs to teach us humility and needs to teach us to deal with the fact that we are always going to be uncertain. That doesn't mean we don't stand up for our values. It doesn't mean we don't stand up for what we think to be right, but that we are always doing it with a certain amount of humility. And I like to end with this quote by Richard Feynman, which says that I would rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned. And I really do think this quote sums up what I think of is what the goal of a philosopher is to ask a lot of questions and rarely answer any questions, right? We want to ask good questions, provide nuance and distinctions to those questions, and rarely will we come to answers. And that's okay. We got to make peace with that. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed something in here. And if you did enjoy something, I hope you dig deeper, read some of these books that Russell and Wittgenstein wrote, or watch some videos explaining their lives a little bit more in detail. And, here you see this art that I made using an AI art generator that kind of captures this idea that on the left, you see mathematics, which is this tool to try to conceptualize the world, which you can think of as just a metaphor for like rational thought and the analytic philosophy approach to things. And on the right, you see just the chaos of how I see the underlying world and how I see human beings and history and all this stuff. It's just this controlled chaos. And it's just this beautiful colored sort of human thing that we get to feel. It's music, it's art, it's all this terrible parts of life too, like war and violence. It's all that shit just wrapped up into this awful sort of controlled chaos. And we try to bridge these two gaps as best we can. but we still haven't figured this out, and we probably never will. And here are the sources I used that I've read over the past year, and discussed with my philosophy discussion group. And I would just point to this book, Wittgenstein by A.C. Grayling. If you're interested in digging a little deeper, but you're looking for something that just kind of gives an overview, this is a great short overview of Wittgenstein and also Russell and some of the logical positivist views that come up in here. And only in 120 pages, he brings you through a lot of ideas. So I really highly recommend that. And so I hope you enjoyed this talk, and please, let me know how you felt. Let me know how you react. If you don't like something, let me know. I love to disagree, productively with you on this channel. Um, and please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope to see you at another video at some point. Thank you.